Please get up, the court is coming, the bailiff solemnly announces, and the hall obediently rises. Judge Michael Thompson enters the courtroom with his usual confident gait. In his 25 years on the Atlanta Supreme Court, he has learned to maintain a calm appearance under any circumstances. Today is an ordinary day, a regular hearing in the case of petty theft. Only wrinkles around the eyes and barely noticeable gray hair on the temples betray his age. Judge Thompson is renowned for her fairness and ability to see potential in even the most complex defendants. But today's business will make even his hardened heart tremble. Case number 243, the secretary begins monotonously. Defendant James Williams, 18 years old, charged with shoplifting. The door opens and the convoy starts a young black guy. Something imperceptibly familiar flashed across his face, causing Judge Thompson to involuntarily tense. Those eyes. He had seen those eyes somewhere before. The defendant looks frightened, but behaves with strange dignity. His gaze, originally lowered down, suddenly rises and meets the gaze of the judge. Time seems to freeze. Your Honor, the lawyer begins, but he is interrupted by an unexpected exclamation from the defendant. Wait! The guy's voice trembles with excitement. I have something to say. The hall begins to whisper. Judge Thompson raises his hand, demanding silence, but something in the boy's voice makes his heart beat faster. I have a photo, James continues, pulling the frayed picture out of his pocket. It was given to me by a social worker in an orphanage. She said it was the only thing left of my parents. The judge feels cold sweat coming out on his forehead. He remembers this photo. He remembers the day it was made exactly 20 years ago, a week before that terrible accident. You are my father, James says quietly but confidently, and his words fall into the dead silence of the courtroom like stones in a calm lake. Judge Thompson feels his hands tremble. Images of the past float before our eyes, a smiling wife, a newborn son, that fatal call about an accident, a funeral, and an empty crib that was never found after the accident. I'd been looking for you all my life, James continues, tears glistening in his eyes. Every time I saw your name on the news I felt. I knew. Judge Thompson stands up. For the first time in his entire career, he doesn't know what to say. His professional mask cracks, and the face of his father, who has been mourning his lost son for 20 years, appears through it. A break is announced, he says faintly, and his voice betrays him, breaking down at the last word. A stunned silence falls in the courtroom. The world around freezes when father and son, separated by 20 years in fate, finally look into each other's eyes, finding in them a reflection of their own pain, hope, and indescribable joy of meeting. Judge Michael Thompson sits in his office, clutching an old photograph in trembling hands. On it is a happy young family. Himself, his wife Sarah, and newborn son. 20 years. For 20 long years he lived with the thought that he had lost them forever. It was raining that day, he says quietly to his assistant John, who brought coffee. Sarah insisted on taking the little one to her mother. I was supposed to go with them, but I was late for an important meeting. Memories cover him with a wave. He remembers every detail of that fateful evening, the call from the hospital, the rain-soaked road, the wrecked car on the side of the road. Sarah could not be saved. And the body of my son. The body of his son was never found. The police assumed that the car was carried out into the river. The judge's voice trembles. We searched for weeks. I spent all my savings on private detectives. But nothing. John listens silently, realizing that something extraordinary is happening now. In his 15 years on the job, he had never seen Judge Thompson so vulnerable. Do you know what's the worst? The judge gets up and goes to the window. I never stopped looking. Every time a story about a found child appeared on the news, I hoped. Every Christmas I bought a gift that remained under the tree. There is a soft knock on the door. The court secretary enters with a folder of documents. Your Honor, we have found the case of James Williams. He was placed in the infant custody system. He was found, the secretary pauses, by the river, wrapped in a blanket with the monogram SD. The judge turns sharply. Sarah Thompson, he whispers. It was Sarah's favorite quilt. He remembers that day. Sarah insisted on taking a warm blanket for the baby. It's cool outside, she said. The same blanket that she embroidered with her own hands when she was expecting a child. But how? Asked John. How did he survive? A miracle, the judge replies, and his eyes fill with tears. A real miracle. And now he appeared before me as a defendant. The judge looks at the clock. The meeting should resume in 10 minutes. But how can he judge his own son? How can he look into those eyes, Sarah's eyes, and pass judgment? John, the judge's voice becomes firmer. Contact the laboratory. We need an urgent DNA test. And find me all the documents about that accident. Everything down to the smallest detail. He looks at the photo again. Now he understands why Jame's face seems so familiar. The same features, the same look. The heart shrinks at the thought of all the years they have lost. And one more thing, the judge adds, heading for the door. Call Judge Harrison. I can't handle this case. Personal conflict of interest. As he leaves the office, Judge Thompson feels the heavy burden of 20 years of grief begin to let go of his heart little by little. There is a long way to go, but for the first time in many years, he sees the light of hope. James Williams sits in the interrogation room, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. A social worker, Miss Anderson, who has taken care of him for the past 5 years, lays out yellow documents in front of the detective. James was a special kid, she begins, pulling out an old observation diary. From the very beginning. You know, most children in the custody system lose hope of finding their family. But not him. Children's drawings appear on the table, dozens of images of a man in a court robe. James had been drawing them for years, not even knowing for sure who his father was. I was 6 when I first saw Judge Thompson on TV, James says quietly. Something just clicked inside. I couldn't explain the feeling, but it wouldn't let me go. Miss Anderson pulls out a 10-year-old newspaper clipping. Pictured as Judge Thompson after a high-profile trial. James kept every article about him. Sometimes I just sat and looked at the photos. But life in the system was not easy, she continues. 7 different foster families. Some were good, others, not so much. James began to run away. At first I just wandered around the city then. I was looking for the judge's house, James interrupts her. Every time. I didn't even know his address, I just walked the streets hoping for a miracle. The detective flips through police reports, petty offenses, fights at school, escapes from foster families. A typical story of a difficult teenager from the guardianship system. But in the boy's eyes, he sees something else, not anger or despair, but unquenchable hope. That day at the store, James stammers. I didn't want to steal. Just saw in the newspaper that Judge Thompson will preside over this week's hearings. I needed money for a bus to court. I had to see him. Miss Anderson takes out the last document, an envelope yellowed from time. This is the only thing that happened to him when he was found. A blanket with the monogram SD in this envelope. Inside is half of a photograph of a young woman. We've been trying to find the other half for years. James looks at a photo of his mother, the only thing he has left of the past. Now he knows that the other half of this photo has been in Judge Thompson's office all this time. You know, says Miss Anderson, gathering documents, in 20 years of work, I have seen many cases. But there is no such thing. Sometimes it seems that fate has its own sense of humor. Or justice. Footsteps are heard in the corridor. The door opens and Judge Thompson appears on the doorstep. In his hands is the second half of the same photo. I think it's time to put all the pieces of this story together, he says, his voice trembling with pent-up emotion. The city's forensic laboratory is filled with the quiet hum of devices. Judge Thompson stands by the window, watching as the technician carefully takes a DNA sample. His heart beats so hard that it seems everyone in the room can hear it. The results will be ready in 48 hours, says Dr. Reynolds, the laboratory's lead expert. But, Judge Thompson, I must warn you. Even if it's your son. 20 years is a very long time. The judge nods, taking out old photos from the folder. One of them shows newborn James in the hospital, with a characteristic mole on his right shoulder. The guy who was brought to court has exactly the same mole. Look at this. The judge lays out the documents about the accident on the table. That evening, the river was full of water due to the rains. The current could carry the child several miles downstream. Where exactly was the boy found? The doctor asks, studying the map. Near the old Riverside Bridge, replies Detective Johnson, who has been standing silently in the corner all this time. The fisherman noticed something in the reeds. The child was wrapped in a blanket, which probably saved her life. Judge Thompson feels the ground shake beneath his feet. He remembers that bridge. He often went there to work. How many times has he passed by a place where his son might have been without even knowing it? And what does the guy himself say? Asks Dr. Reynolds. He remembers dreams, the judge replies. Dreams about water and a lullaby. Sarah. My wife always sang to him before going to bed. Silence falls in the room, broken only by the sounds of laboratory equipment. Everyone present understands the importance of the moment. One study can change the lives of two people forever. Hey Ray, something else interesting. Detective Johnson pulls out an old hospital report. The baby found near the river had 2 broken ribs. And in James' medical record there is a record of old fractures that healed in early childhood. The judge turns away, trying to hide his tears. He recalls the doctor's words after the accident. The blow was so strong that it could have caused similar injuries. Judge Thompson, Dr. Reynolds says gently, I understand your feelings. But you have to be prepared for any outcome. Sometimes hope can play a cruel joke on us. You know, doctor, the judge replies, looking at James' photo, when I first saw him in the courtroom, something inside me just knew. You can't deceive a father's heart. At this moment, the laboratory door opens, and an assistant enters with preliminary blood test results. Everyone in the room is holding their breath. The first page of a report can be the beginning of a new story or the end of a long-standing hope. The corridors of the court never seemed so long to Judge Thompson. In his hands he clutches an envelope with the results of a DNA test, a document that can change everything. His assistant John walks nearby, holding a folder with all the evidence collected. 99 whole and 0.9%, the judge whispers, rereading the result over and over again. James is my son. A scientifically proven fact. Outside the doors of the conference room, everyone involved in the case is already waiting. The prosecutor, James' lawyer, Miss Anderson, Detective Johnson and, of course, James himself. Each of them played a role in this incredible story. Before we start, the judge says, entering the courtroom, I want everyone to understand that this is not just a legal situation. This is a story about miracles, about hope, and about the fact that some ties cannot be broken even by time. James sits motionless, his eyes fixed on the envelope in the judge's hands. His whole life, all his searches, all his dreams and hopes, it all comes down to this moment. The results are positive, the judge announces, and his voice trembles. James, you are really my son. The silence in the hall becomes almost perceptible. Miss Anderson sobs softly, clutching a folder containing James' story to her chest, a story that has finally found its completion. But that's not all, the judge continues, taking out old documents. We have restored the full picture of what happened 20 years ago. Accident, river, rescue. Every piece of this puzzle has finally fallen into place. Detective Johnson lays out photographs and maps on the table. The scene of the accident, the course of the river, the bridge where the baby was found. Everything adds up to one incredible but real story of salvation. I want to officially declare, the prosecutor says, summing up, that all the charges against James Williams, that is, James Thompson, are filmed, taking into account the circumstances and nature of the offense. But his words are interrupted by James' unexpected step. The boy stands up and slowly approaches the judge. For the first time in their lives, the son and father stand face to face, knowing the whole truth. I always knew, James says quietly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Every time I saw you on TV, something inside screamed, "It's him, it's your father!" Judge Thompson can no longer hold back. He takes a step forward and hugs his son tightly. At this moment, all titles and titles disappear. Only father and son remain, who found each other after 20 years of separation. You know, Miss Anderson says quietly, wiping away her tears, in all my years in the care system, this is the first time I've seen a story end this way. It's real. A miracle, the judge finishes for her, not letting go of her son. A real miracle. That was your mother's room, Judge Thompson says quietly as he opens the door to a bright bedroom in his house. James enters carefully, touching the old photos on the walls. I haven't changed anything here since the accident. 2 weeks have passed since that fateful day in court. Every step towards a normal life is not easy. Too much time was lost, too many wounds remained in the souls of both. And this, the judge opens the cabinet and takes out a small wooden box. These are all the gifts I bought you for every Christmas. 20 boxes. 20 years of hope. James sits down on the floor, gently touching the wrapped packages. Each of them is evidence of parental love, which has not faded all these years. Toys for a toddler, books for a schoolboy, sports equipment for a teenager. You know, James says, unwrapping one of the gifts, in the orphanage, I always imagined myself celebrating Christmas with a real family. And now. His voice breaks. Judge Thompson sits down next to him, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. They are still learning to touch each other, learning to be a family. The neighbors are already starting to gossip, the judge smiles. The press also haunts me. The story of the judge who found his son in the courtroom became a sensation. I got calls from 3 talk shows, James picks up. They want to be interviewed. But I'm not sure, it all feels so personal. The doorbell rings. It was Miss Anderson who brought the last paperwork for James' new paperwork. Now he will officially become James Thompson. Do you know what's the hardest? Asks James when they're alone. Get used to the fact that now I can just come home. That I have a home. Real. Judge Thompson takes the keys out of his pocket. These are yours. I wanted to give them to you on the first day, but I thought it would take time. James takes the keys and his hands are shaking. So many times he dreamed of this moment, and now he doesn't know what to say. Do you know what I noticed? The judge suddenly says. You drink coffee just like your mother. 3 tablespoons of sugar, and a little cinnamon. She always did that. These small discoveries, common traits, habits, tastes, become bridges across the abyss of lost years. Every day brings something new. The father learns that his son loves jazz, as he does. The son discovers that he has his father's handwriting. Tomorrow they will come from television, the judge reminds. Are you sure you're ready? You know, James replies after a pause, I think our story can help others. To those who are still looking. To those who do not lose hope. They sit in a room, surrounded by things from the past, but look to the future. There is still a lot of unknown ahead. Many difficult moments and joyful discoveries. But most importantly, they are no longer alone.